Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 26, verse 24, which reads, "Enemies disguise themselves with their lips, but in their hearts they harbor deceit." The reason I wanted to look at this verse in particular is because, we just spent time in Proverbs 25, 21 to 22, examining what it looks like to respond to an enemy with genuine generosity and unexpected love. But now, Proverbs 26:24 arrives with what feels like a jarring shift in tone. After being told to feed our enemies, we are now being told that enemies disguise themselves with their lips while harboring deceit in their hearts. And I think the placement of these two passages in proximity to each other within the same broader section of Proverbs is not an accident. I think they are addressing two different but equally necessary dimensions of wisdom in relation to people who mean us harm. The first dimension is the character we bring to those relationships. The second is the discernment we need to navigate them, right? Loving our enemies does not require being naive about them, and being discerned about deception does not contradict the call to generosity, right? Wisdom holds both together, and the failure to hold both is what produces either dangerous naiveness on one side or the kind of defensive cynicism that cannot extend true love on the other. And so Proverbs 26:24 is ultimately a verse about the gap between words and hearts, between what people present on the surface and what is actually operating underneath. And I think that gap is one of the most consistently consequential realities of human social life, and Solomon addresses it with the directness it deserves. So let's break down the verse. Enemies disguise themselves with their lips. The word enemies here describes genuine adversaries, people who are actively working against our well-being. But the specific kind of enemy this verse is concerned with is not the open, declared opponent whose hostility is visible and therefore at least you're able to navigate, right? But it is actually the enemies whose hostility is concealed behind words designed to create an entirely different impression. Disguise themselves translates a Hebrew word which means to make unrecognizable, to conceal identity or intention behind a false presentation. It's the language of deliberate masking. So this is not someone who is simply being polite in an awkward situation, but it is someone who has intentionally constructed a verbal presentation designed to prevent you from perceiving what is actually going on beneath it. With their lips specifies the instrument of the disguise, right? Language, speech, the very tool that Proverbs elsewhere celebrates as capable of bringing life, healing, and genuine sweetness is here being used as the mechanism of concealment, right? The lips that can speak gracious words and function as honeycomb, as we saw in Proverbs 16:24, can also be deployed as a mask behind which genuine malice operates without detection. And I think this is worth sitting with carefully because it exposes a vulnerability that most of us prefer not to think about. We're generally conditioned to take words at face value unless we have been given specific reason not to. And so when someone speaks kindly to us, we tend to assume the kindness is genuine. When someone expresses concern for our well-being, we tend to receive it as real concern. And I think that default toward charitable interpretation is not inherently wrong, but it's sincerely the right posture. But Proverbs 26:24 here, I think, is introducing a category of situation where that default, if applied without any discernment, can leave us genuinely vulnerable to people whose lips are saying one thing while their hearts are doing something else entirely. I also think the verse is not calling us to paranoia or to the kind of global suspicion that creates every kind of word as a potential deception. But I think it is calling us to the specific kind of discernment that recognizes this pattern when it is actually present, rather than being willfully blind to it in the name of charitable interpretation or conflict avoidance. Psalm 55:21, which we referenced earlier in the series in the context of Proverbs 5:3, returns to precisely this dynamic. It says, "His speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords." Right? The smoothness of the speech and the war in the heart are not incidental to each other. The smoothness is the instrument through which the war is concealed. David is describing someone whose verbal presentation is functioning as active camouflage for genuine hostility. And this is the same pattern that Solomon identifies in Proverbs 26:24. And the fact that it appears in multiple places in the wisdom and devotional literature of Israel tells us that it is a consistent feature of human experience that wisdom has to address rather than ignore. Let's talk about the part of the verse that says, but in their hearts they harbor deceit. The second half of the verse, I think, pulls back the curtain on what is actually behind the verbal disguise. The word harbor describes something that is being kept inside, stored, maintained, and preserved. The deceit in the enemy's heart is not a momentary lapse or a situational deception born of desperation. It is something that is being actively maintained, a settled orientation of the inner life that the verbal surface is specifically designed to conceal. Deceit, murma, is one of the stronger Hebrew words for treachery, fraud, and deliberate false teaching. It describes not just individual deceptive acts, but a fundamental orientation of the heart towards the manipulation of others for personal advantage or the harm of an adversary. The enemy of Proverbs 26:24 is not confused about what they are doing. The deceit is harbored, which means it is known, kept, and intentional. Right, and I think this is where the verse makes its most important theological point, and it is the point that connects most directly to the broader wisdom tradition on the relationship between words and the heart. We've already established throughout the series that the heart is the source of which all speech ultimately flows. Luke 6:45 stated this plainly, out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. Proverbs 26:24 is describing the specific case where what the mouth is speaking is engineered to conceal rather than reveal what the heart is actually contains. And I think the disconnect between lip and heart that this verse describes is therefore not just a social or relational problem, but it is literally a moral one. Proverbs 12:20, as we examined earlier in the series, states directly, deceit is in the heart of those who devise evil. The deceit and the evil are not separate, right? The harboring of deceit in the heart itself is a description of a heart that has been organized around the pursuit of harmful ends through deceptive means. It's the integrated portrait of a person whose inner life and outer presentation have been deliberately misaligned. Even in Proverbs, the next couple verses in this chapter 26 complete a picture in a way that is worth including because they show Solomon developing the thought rather than leaving it as a diagnosis. It says, when he speaks graciously, do not believe him, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Though his hatred is covered with deception, his wickedness will be exposed in the assembly. Right, and so the gracious speech is exactly the lips of verse 24. The 7 abominations in the heart is the deceit being harbored. And the exposure in the assembly is the inevitable result when the gap between the verbal surface and the actual heart cannot be maintained indefinitely. And that final detail, I believe, the exposure in the assembly, connects to a principle we have seen throughout Proverbs and across the biblical witness. Concealed wickedness does not remain concealed forever. Right? Numbers 32:23 states it with memorable directness. It says, be sure your sin will find you out. The harbored deceit and the disguising lips eventually fail to maintain the gap between surface and reality, and when they do, the exposure tends to be public and consequential. And this is the same pattern we noted in Proverbs 22:8 with the sowing and reaping of injustice. Right? The harvest of a harbored deceit is a calamity that arrives on its own timeline, regardless of how sophisticated the disguise was in the meantime. So let's get practical here. Let's get applicable. Because, I truly believe that turning knowledge into action is one of the most important things we could do in our Christian life. The first thing is to develop the discernment to read patterns rather than individual words. I think the most practically important application of this verse is the development of a specific kind of discernment that does not evaluate people exclusively on the basis of what they say in any given moment, but on the basis of consistent patterns over time. Right? A single kind word from someone proves very little about the condition of their heart. A sustained pattern of behavior that consistently contradicts the kind words tells a much more reliable story. Proverbs 20:11 makes this principle explicit. It says, even a child makes himself known by his acts, whether his conduct is pure and upright. Acts over time are the more reliable indicator than words in the moment. And I think practically this means developing the habit of tracking consistency between what people say and what they do, between the verbal presentation and the actual pattern of behavior, before extending the kind of trust that the verbal presentation alone is designed to solicit. The second thing is to guard our own hearts against the version of this pattern that operates in us. I think the most uncomfortable application of Proverbs 26:24 is the one that turns the verse inward. The harboring of deceit in the heart while the lips produce a different impression is a pattern that is not unique to our desired or to our declared enemies, but it's actually a pattern that each of us is capable of in various forms and degrees. The person we present to our community, our employer, our church, the people whose respect we want, is not always identical to the person who is actually operating on the inside. And I think that is not always malicious. Some of the gap between our presented self and our actual inner life is simply the natural complexity of human beings navigating social contexts. But some of it is the same harbor deceit that Solomon is describing, right? The maintenance of a verbal surface designed to prevent people from seeing what is actually going on underneath. And I think honest self-examination about where our lips and our hearts are misaligned and the pursuit of that kind of integrity that closes the gap is one of the most important applications of this verse for people who want to be genuinely wise rather than just appearing to be. Third thing, respond to discerned deception with wisdom rather than either naivety or retaliation. When we have genuinely discerned that someone's gracious lips are concealing harbored deceit, I think the response wisdom calls for is neither the naiveness or naivety that ignores what we have seen, nor the retaliation that Proverbs 20:22 forbade. But it is the wise management of appropriate distance and appropriate trust. Proverbs 4:23 gives us the framework. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. Right? The vigilance keeping of the heart is not paranoia. It is the appropriate protection of what is most valuable against people who have not demonstrated, or who have demonstrated through their pattern of behavior that their lips and their hearts are not aligned. And I think practically this means adjusting the level of trust and access we extend to someone in proportion to what we have actually observed about the relationship between their speech and their conduct, without becoming either globally suspicious of everyone or vengefully hostile toward those whose deception we have discerned. So let me just give a closing thought here. Proverbs 26:24 sits in necessary tension with Proverbs 25:21 and 22 about loving our enemies. And I think the tension is productive rather than contradictory. We are called to love our enemies generously and to be discerning about what our enemies are actually doing. We're called to extend unexpected kindness and to maintain appropriate wisdom about the gap between words and hearts. The wisdom tradition does not ask us to choose between these postures. It asks us to hold both, which is significantly harder than choosing either one alone. The lips can disguise what the heart contains. Wisdom knows this and is neither paralyzed by it or naive about it. It simply sees more clearly than the disguise was designed to allow. And it responds with both the love that disarms and the discernment that protects, both at once. And that is what it means to be wise.